God calls me to love my Trump friends, right? And God calls me to love my friends that are maybe from LGBTQ community, right?
Yeah.
And my job is to love on them, to treat them like Jesus, and hopefully walk a pathway so that when I have the opportunity to share the hope of Jesus, that becomes primary.
Welcome to a Listen to Learn episode of the Share Life podcast. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, and today I'm speaking with Joe Handley. Joe, say hello.
Hello there, Jason. Good to be with you.
Yes. We're going to be talking about changing the few who change the many. Reverend Joseph W. Handley, Jr., Ph.D. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. But I go by Joe, so just call me
We'll call
Joe.
you. So you've devoted your life to accelerating leaders for the mission. You serve as the president and CEO of A3, a global network that equips leaders for the church and marketplace. You serve as a global catalyst for leadership with the
Mhm.
Lausanne movement, as an affiliated faculty at Fuller Theological Seminary, as well as a tutor for the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. You were the founding director of Azusa Pacific University's Office of World Mission and lead mission pastor at Rolling Hills Covenant Church. And you've written a couple books, Polycentric Mission Leadership and Leading Well in Times of Disruption. His organization, A3, nurtures intentional learning communities to build and sustain Christ's leaders around the world. And it was this model, changing the few that changed the many, that was what compelled me to reach out to Joe and say, hey, I want to talk to you about that on the podcast. And so tell us, where did that come from? What's the origin of that?
So that was over years, our mission has had various taglines or mottos, right? And when I came into the mission, we started kind of refining, retooling who we are,
Yeah.
and thinking broader. So we were working pretty heavily with missionaries in Japan that were working with churches, and then over and above that, we were also just equipping pastors. And then we started working with marketplace leaders. And as we were retooling everything, this idea struck us. And really, where it came from is fascinating. I mean, one of our teammates came up with it, obviously. But we had spent some time with a mutual friend, Jason, a guy named Steve Woodworth, and his company was kind of guiding us through some of this process, which is really cool. They did a great
Yeah.
job.
Okay.
Um, and but the idea of this is much deeper and much more historic. So
Yeah.
you go back in history, we're a mission, so we're all about Christ-centered leaders to accelerate mission in the world.
Yeah.
And we look back at Jesus himself, and how did he do this? What was his strategy? And sometimes the way I like to frame it is, I get in front of a group of business leaders and I say, what is the greatest brand in the world today? And brainstorm Coca-Cola, McDonald's, whatever, Starbucks, all sorts of stuff. And then as we pause, we think, wait a minute, the only thing that is virtually everywhere on the planet, except for a few really remote places, uh, is the gospel. The Church of Christ is everywhere. And
Yeah.
so, really, Jesus' work is the greatest brand on planet Earth. There's nothing that compares.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was his strategy? And he had an alternative strategy. And so this is fascinating because you look at the life of churches today, and oftentimes guys like me, I'm a pastor, um, we aspire to have the biggest church on planet Earth or whatever, right? And but Jesus didn't work that way. In fact,
Yeah.
very few of the stories Jesus tells are with large crowds. Now, that to me says something, that's an important space. There's a place for speaking to the large crowds, and there's a place for those big churches, and it takes uniquely gifted people to do that.
Yeah.
But Jesus spent very little time there. And so
Yeah.
we were pondering, how did Jesus develop people? What does
Yeah.
disciple making really, really look like? And we're about reproducing disciple making leaders at our core,
Yeah.
A3.
And
So, yeah.
would you just define that a little bit? Like when you say, what is it, like, what do you define as a disciple in that regard?
Yeah, a disciple is someone who follows Christ. So it's not just someone that goes forward and raises their hand and says, "Yeah, I'm in. Salvation plan. I'm good for eternity." It is truly somebody who is following in the footsteps of Jesus. That's
Hmm.
it's not just a decision you make and then okay, I'm good. It's
Yeah.
it's really a commitment to look at his teachings and say, I want to follow this guy, this Messiah, this,
Hmm.
not just thought leader, but a change agent, someone
Yeah.
who really turned the world upside down. I mean, I don't think anything else compares to Jesus' influence on the planet.
Hmm.
And so, someone who really truly follows all of his teachings,
Hmm.
that's a follower of Christ, and that's a disciple. And in our case, we're trying to fulfill the Great Commission, which is meant to be reproducible. So
Yeah.
it's not just a decision, like I said earlier, and it's not just I want to grow to be a follower.
Hmm.
Rather, it's someone who reproduces that in others. It's a
Yeah.
multiplying factor. And so when we look at this story, back to the big, Jesus, where did he spend his time in leader development? Right?
Mm.
He had a few stories with the big crowds. He had a few more stories teaching and preaching in synagogues. But where did he spend most of his time? He did it with 12 people.
Yeah.
He said, and then he even had some smaller subsets, sometimes groups of three and sometimes one-on-one. But a big portion of his time was walking with 12. And so when we say changing the few who change the many, we're trying to follow in Jesus' footsteps. And our niche within developing leaders and reproducing disciple making leaders,
Hmm.
we think we're in that niche that is um, focused on the 12. Now,
Yeah.
sometimes we fudge on that. Sometimes we go to just 8 or 10. And other times we go up to 20. It's a little
Yeah.
too much, but we do that. And so every one of those is important. It's important. You get inspiration when you go to a big training conference and it's like, wow, I'm enthralled, right? And
Yeah.
then when you get down to the smaller subgroups like 50 to 25 or 75, you can go home with some nice new tools in your hand. Say,
Hmm.
hey, this will plug and play here.
Yeah.
When you get down to the few, you can go deep in each other's lives.
Hmm.
And you can really learn and grow in what it means to be a follower of Christ. For instance, one of the biggest problems in Christian leadership today is the same biggest problem in overall leadership, and that is character.
How do you
How
define
we
that?
treat how do we
Yeah.
treat other
Yeah.
people? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. This morning I woke up. I had a late night. I flew in at like midnight. My poor wife picked me up at the airport, and then we had to get going early in the morning.
Yeah.
So here I am, ready to roll. How am I going to treat my wife when I wake up groggy?
Yeah.
Do I need a cup of coffee to have a good attitude, or am I going to treat her
Yeah.
like Jesus would want me to treat her, right?
Yeah.
And so that type of thing. Or let's say you're in the marketplace or you're in your church, either way, doesn't matter.
Hmm.
How do you treat your employees? Or
Hmm.
in a church, how do you treat deacons and elders or, the lay people in your church? Or
Yeah.
um, if you run a company, how you treat your employees matters. And so these are character issues that really define the strength of your leadership. So we do a deep dive on character formation.
Yeah.
And I've even talked to guys that after the process that's a 2-year journey with us. Um, they used to be enemies. In fact,
Oh,
their
wow.
pastor that used to think the other was stealing people from their church. Right? They
Yeah.
said stealing sheep is the word they'd use. And at halfway through the program, they realized that that was not the case, and they became lifelong friends.
Mm.
And now they meet with each other twice a month to go over the plans that they had developed. How am I going to grow as a Christ follower? What's my plan for reproducing others? What's my plan for growing my church? And part of that meeting together twice a month, they said it this way, which is great for a guy like me, a Californian. I was surprised that two guys from India said this, but they said, Joe, he knows all my junk and I know all his junk, right?
Yeah.
And so they're walking through all those character issues that really define who you are as a leader. And
Yeah.
so that's a little breaking out of what those character issues are like.
Yeah. So there's a few things I want to tease out from what you said. You talked about just how Jesus turned the world upside down, and I
Yeah.
think this kind of ties into the character piece because he turned a violent world, a violent paradigm upside down by not
Yes.
using violence.
Yep.
Right. So
Yep.
talk to us about that because if you're doing global missions, I'm sure that you face that type of violence around the world more so than we do in America.
Holy cow. And increasingly so in our country, my friend.
Yeah.
We've got a very polarized dynamic here in the
Yeah.
States. It's very challenging to live into. And when you take that abroad, it is more complicated. I
Hmm.
work in many areas where the church is under significant duress and
Hmm.
pressure. Right now, we're dealing with a situation in Myanmar that's very
Hmm.
complicated with a,
Yeah.
a, a military coup that took over, along with an earthquake, and these kind of pressure cookers really get to you.
Yeah.
And how you handle those messes really matters. So let's
Hmm.
say you got pressure from a government official or a police officer or somebody from a different faith in your country.
Yeah.
How you respond to them matters. Think of it
Mm.
this way, Jason. I'm driving down the street and I'm going over the speed limit, and a
Yeah.
police officer pulls me over. Sir, I want to see your license, blah, blah, right? Right.
Yeah.
And what happens if I say, I wasn't speeding? What's wrong with you? Right? There's a character issue. Okay. There's a whole different ballgame if that's how I respond.
Yeah.
Or if I say, I am sorry, officer. I realize I was speeding and that's wrong.
Yeah.
And shame on me. I'm a pastor. I should know better. Right? That's even
Yeah.
even
You're talking
stronger
about
on the
taking
character.
responsibility. Yeah. Taking responsibility. Yeah.
Yeah. So you own it. You own it, and that's a character issue. And when
Mm.
you do that, the situation moves from what could become more toxic to a healthy respect issue where
Mm.
you actually grow in that situation and you become a person of influence. So you're
Mm.
changing the few who change the many. I have countless stories of pastors that are under pressure and they're forced to meet with some government official once a week. Some places they call it coffee time. They have to meet with a government official, and it starts with interrogation. But over time, week after week after week after week, they become best friends.
Mm.
And the guy starts investing in the government official's life. And one day, one of my friends told this police officer, he said, Sir, do you realize that you have the best job in the world? And the police officer was stunned. He goes, Are you crazy? Every single working hour of the day, I have to meet with a guy like you and interrogate you and make sure you're not going against government policy. How in the world is that the best job in the world? And my friend said, Friend, I don't know anybody that gets to meet hour after hour with a prince, someone who represents the Prince of Peace,
Yeah.
someone
Mm.
who is sharing the good news of our faith in Christ and how that penetrates society and makes lives better. You yourself
Yeah.
in our dialogue, you've learned how alcoholism can be changed,
Yeah.
how drug addiction can be changed, how we no longer have huge problems with gambling or prostitution or whatnot. Who could have a better job than you? And this police officer said, Hey, friend, if it weren't for this uniform, I would follow your Jesus. And my friend
Mm.
said, The uniform doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So those are ways you change the few. who
Mm.
change the many, and it has a reproducing effect. It
Yeah.
has a calming effect. And I think if you and I assume most of our listeners here are in the US space. Um, if we have that kind of engagement with the guy next door that is on the other side of the political fence, imagine a difference we would make.
Hmm.
Instead of berating them for the opinion they have, or they're in a different space, politically, why badger them and
Hmm.
say, you're an idiot
Hmm.
for that point of view or whatever. Instead, say, hey, let me point you to this guy, and here's how he's changed my life. Right?
Yeah.
It makes a
Mm.
wild difference in the world, and we see it reproducing on countless levels. In one country, Jason, this is really profound.
Yeah.
The leaders we are working with were praying about how can we really make a change in our society, even beyond church planting, which is one of our primary objectives. And they were planting churches like mad.
Yeah.
They decided to tackle human trafficking in their country,
Mm.
and they were making such a difference that the government officials that were watching them, and this is in an atheist country, a communist country, and the communists were worried about the religious intolerance in their nation, and they were being attacked by one of the religious groups. And these guys saw the church making such a difference. They came up to one of our pastors and said, whatever you're doing is impacting the way our children are facing reality of tomorrow. And
Yeah.
they're being trafficked into other countries for terrible trades, either
Yeah.
slavery in the sex industry or slavery in, domestic care. But instead, you guys are helping salvage their lives, putting them into
Hmm.
halfway homes or getting them back home. And we believe you could help us. We're
Hmm.
having trouble with this other religion, and even though we're communists, we think that it might be good to have religious freedom in our country.
Yeah.
You're not going to believe what they asked them to do. They
What's that?
said, would you help us write the first religious liberty clause in our state constitution history? That
Wow.
country had never had religious liberty built into their constitution, and today they do,
Mm.
because people were willing to be different in the world. They stood up in a positive way, with good character, making a positive influence. The ripple effects of that were enormous. It's
Yeah.
game changing.
Yeah. What is it that those Christians had that you feel like you'd like American Christians to appreciate and move towards?
Yeah, I think they wanted to be salt and light. And
Mm.
it's not just Americans, it's all of us. I,
Yeah.
I, I need to learn from them. Of course, I'm an American, but it doesn't matter if you're from India or China or wherever. Um, it's learning to be like Christ would be.
Hmm.
That old phrase, what would Jesus do?
Yeah.
When I'm in the middle of the heat, and not like I'm the greatest guy. Joe doesn't always practice this, right? Like I could have done a better job with my wife this morning, probably, right?
Yeah.
um, but when we lean into that, when we let Christ fill us and really let Him shape who we are, when we're walking in a deep walk with Him day by day, our character improves and the way we treat others improves, and our business becomes a light.
Hmm.
You think about the best companies you love. Um, when you go in there, they treat you well.
Yeah.
Customer service is very high. Why do they do that? Because it's good business. Well, Jesus has good business practices.
Yeah.
He wants you to treat people well. When people are treated well, they come back to your business or they come back to your church. So
Yeah.
I'd say if it's one thing we could learn from these friends of mine, they have learned to do a deep walk with Christ, not just reading the Bible every morning and going through the ropes and Sunday and all that with church. They're letting the scriptures, they're letting Jesus and their prayer life influence how they behave. These
Yeah.
guys in India that I was telling about, He knows all my junk, and I know all his junk. I'll tell you another story from China. One time, these guys were gathering in a 2-year cohort, and one of the guys came with this huge, massive scratch on his face. And brother, what's wrong? How can we help you? Is what they were saying. They rallied around him, and he go, "Oh, no, no, no! I fell off the subway and slid on the gravel, and it scratched up my face." And then 2 days in, he was convicted because of the deep walk with Christ. He knew he was lying. He was
Mm,
not telling the truth to his friends, and he started crying. And he goes, "Friends, I have a confession to make. I didn't fall off the subway this morning. Instead, I got in a fight with my wife. And I actually took my fist and swung it at her. And she was trying to protect herself. So she reached out and started scratching me.
mhm,
My wife, my marriage is a mess, and I need help." And they said, "Hey, friend, let's walk together." They got him into counseling. They personally went and met with them as a couple and started to heal into their marriage. And it's those kind of things that really make a difference in life. And then when we talk about changing the few who change the many, this is the kind of thing that we see
yeah.
happen.
Now, if that wife or that husband's watching right now, what would you tell them? If they're scared to tell the truth, or if they're in that situation, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think part of it is shining the light of Christ yourself. Is it best? I mean, it's one thing to protect yourself. Sometimes you have to run away.
Mhm.
I would not criticize anybody from running away from a threat, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but and not really a but is the response of scratching your husband the best response? Or the opposite end. Let's say you're the husband that's ticked off. Is it best to punch your wife? Hello, no way. That's not going to help the scenario, right?
It's going to
So
escalate
if
it.
you're
Yeah.
if you're in a dangerous situation, of course, run. You've got to run. If you are absolute dangerous situation, get away and get help. Go to the police. Go to your friends. Go to your family. Get help. But if you're in a situation and you're tempted to do something with malice, it's not going to help. And so try to restrain yourself and say, "Jesus, what would you do in this moment?" And sometimes that is saying, "Okay, I'm not going to retaliate. I'm not going
Mhm.
to fight. I'm going to try to be the bride of Christ in the midst of this difficult situation."
Yeah. Now, I think part of it has to do with we don't always get what we want, and when we don't get what we want, we react.
Mhm.
Talk to us about that.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big growth area because life isn't a bed of roses, right? So we don't we don't have everything we want in life typically. I suppose maybe there's a handful that do, but most of those people that have everything they want, I don't find them to be any happier. So it's not what it's been out to. It's not what it sounds like. Um, so I think it's a recognition that what I have is enough. The Apostle
Mm,
Paul said, "I am content whether I'm in poverty or in wealth," right? And it's learning that contentment factor, which is a Jesus like quality. No matter where I'm at, what
mhm,
and what resources I have, whether it's small or big, it's learning to be content with what we have, not not being greedy for things that we don't
mhm.
have, not being lustful over things we don't have, not desiring things that aren't ours, and saying, "Jesus, this is what you've given me, and I'm
Yeah.
okay with that." And learning to be okay with what we have. I mean, this is the journey for all of us, Jason. That probably you're not perfect in this. I know I'm not. How do we dial back, recalibrate with Christ, and say, "Jesus, in the midst of this, I don't have everything I want. I'm okay. I'm
Yeah.
content." I'll never forget one of a guy who was a renowned speaker. Um, and he was at the top of the ladder one year, as the keynote speaker for this group. And he was giving an example of how the year that he was a keynote speaker, he was flying first class. He had someone to pick him up at the airport, someone to bring him coffee. Everything was catered to for his speaking engagement. 5 years later, he was still speaking at the same event, but not a keynote. No first class ticket, no one picking him up at the airport, no one bringing him coffee, right? And he said, you know what? I don't deserve any more than economy class, right? And he goes, I'm an economy class guy, even though I used to be a first class guy.
Oh,
And
so yeah.
this is where I'm at, right? I used to be first class seat. I used to have a limousine pick me up at the airport and take me to the speaking engagement and have everything I want taken care of. Now I'm just the average Joe. You know, he's still a little more than the average Joe because he's still speaking, but he is not getting all those perks. And he realized, Jesus, this is where I'm at now. It's okay. I'm
Yeah.
content with where I'm at.
Yeah. So one of the other things that you said reminded me just the idea of like changing the few, change the many.
Mhm.
And you talked about the story with the police officer.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen the movie, Steven Spielberg's movie, Munich? Or you might know the real life story behind it,
I,
the
uh,
Olympic terrorist attack and then the assassinations that
oh, I
followed.
know the story. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I did not see the film. Yeah.
Okay. So the movie, there's a scene in the movie where
Mhm.
like I think two of the assassins are like having a fight,
Mm.
just like a verbal fight, like what
Yeah.
are we trying to do here? What are we trying to change? And one of them said something like, if we kill this guy, there's just going to be another guy that goes in his shoes. Like we're not
Mm.
changing anything. We're
Yeah.
just punishing the specific person that did this. And
Right.
so at that moment when I watched it, when it came out,
Mm.
it stuck with me as like, wow, like what is it I'm trying to do here, and how do I actually accomplish that?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about that dynamic.
Yeah. 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 I think that um, when violence begets violence, anytime you're out to get revenge, it doesn't help. And I know
Hmm.
we're tempted to do that, and the world sort of sometimes teaches us to do that,
Yeah.
but it's not true. I've never seen it to be true. Um, that violence just, governments come and go. Genghis Khan was popular for a season, but all of a sudden he's gone. you know and and his influence still spreads in some ways, but today the things that he's noted for are less to do with his violence than to do with other aspects, his humanitarian side.
Hmm.
um and so I think there's a lot of power in that, and I think it's true here too. I think if we're just out to get revenge, it just creates more revenge. It's always going to be tit for tat, back and forth. Whereas if you're paying it forward in a positive way, in a kingdom way, in a Jesus way,
Yeah.
the dividends of that are huge.
Hmm.
Yesterday, I was in a conference in Chicago, and a friend of mine was sharing, and he was being challenged because part of his giving model is to give away 50% of his wealth,
Okay.
50% of his profits every year.
Yeah.
And there was a business professor in the room, and she questioned it. She raised her hand. She goes, "Hey, that's not a part of the normal business incentive, and so that's actually a disincentive." And she challenged him, saying, "That's not an incentive for normal business growth. How would you address that?" And he goes, "I disagree." He goes, "There's enormous incentives for giving away your wealth. Enormous." He goes, "Number one, it makes a kingdom difference forever. Number two, you're helping people's lives. And number three, it's not like pouring that money back into my business is going to make the world any better." And so he really questioned that incentive model. And I think it's the same thing. You know, in that case, it's not a violence issue where you're going
Hmm.
to take somebody out, but
Yeah.
it's how do you deploy your resources? Are you going to approach it with a spirit of giving and generosity, that's set aside to change the world.
Yeah.
And the benefit that brings that guy, that brings him more joy than putting 50% of his profits back in his company.
Mhm.
And he's so happy today doing what he's doing. His company, they started off when his first year with the company, I think he was able to give away $10,000 or $20,000. Now that company is giving away, I think he said $55 million last year.
Wow.
So imagine the profits of that company.
Yeah. Now you said you have the missional side and then the marketplace side.
Yeah,
When I think about entrepreneurship, it is inherently about mentoring. It is inherently about building a team that can do
yeah.
things so that you can do more things together.
Right.
So how does that play a role in the model?
Oh yeah, perfect. Yeah, so we converted the model for marketplace leaders,
Yeah.
and it's very exciting. Now, on the front end, you need to know we're not replacing business practices in this stuff. So most of these guys already know that stuff. They
Yeah.
don't need what they want is the spiritual side, and they want mentors. So I had a key leader in China once tell me, Joe, please send us seasoned veteran leaders. This is a very successful business person. He
Mhm.
said, please send us seasoned veteran leaders. We have no spiritual fathers. And so when they meet with somebody who's older than them, who's got a lot more scars than them, that's been in the mix of business and the tough choices you sometimes have to make, and
Mhm.
yet do it in the light of Christ. That kind of investment in mentoring is huge. Like questions that frequently come up are, in our country, bribes are reality. How do you deal with bribes, right?
Mhm.
And so watching the interaction of how they talk with a more seasoned leader who's been there, done that, and talks about the essence of how do you deal with a bribe, it's a powerful construct. Or another story, I'll give you an example. I was in one of the sessions, and one of the guys said, I'm really having a tough time with my church members. And I said, why? And he said, well, I own two Harley Davidsons, and I have a Harley club that I go out with, once one weekend a month. So I miss church, and the church members are accusing me of choosing mammon rather
Oh.
than God. so so he goes, what do I do with that? And I go, well, it just so happens the faculty member this week, he owns two Teslas, and he just happens to own two Porsches, and oh yeah, he owns two Ferraris. Maybe he'd be worth asking. How does he deal with that? That's because that's on a different scale than two Harleys, right?
Yeah.
And so the guy started meeting with him, and he said, so let me understand your situation and what's going on. And he goes, so let me get this straight. You own two Harleys, and once a month you go on a ride for the weekend, and most of the people riding with you are not believers in Christ, and they call you the Harley pastor. They call you the motorcycle pastor, and your church criticizes you for this. Like isn't that a gospel thing, right? And so it was able to relieve the burden of that guy in that situation. So he realized, what I'm doing and both these guys, by the way, are not like hoarding
Yeah.
things. They're not trying to just accumulate wealth. They just have a few toys, but they're enormously generous people. I bet that one guy is probably the biggest contributor to his church, the Harley Davidson guy, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's just a place to really recalibrate and say, okay, what has Jesus called me to? How does he want me to walk? And how he want me to behave?
Mhm.
And then they can then go from that unpacking to, okay, people criticize me. What do I do with that? How do I respond to that criticism in a healthy, uh, proactive, positive way, a kingdom way, a Jesus way. And
Yeah.
so those are some of the principles that we kind of unpack on the marketplace side that are really profound. And
Yeah.
guys love it. They want to know, um, I know how to run my business, but I don't know exactly how to be a spiritual lead in the marketplace, especially when the in marketplace is like a little leery of the whole religion thing, or the little
Mhm.
leery of the, you know, certain behaviors that are required.
Yeah.
And so those are spaces that these guys can interact and grow, and
Hmm.
it's unbelievable what happens. In one case, there was an entire country that shut down Compassion International.
Oh,
The
wow.
country just shut it down because of a minor flaw. And so the entire cohort, they adopted an entire city of compassion kids and personally took it on with their families. And
Wow.
that's their missional outlay, the initial missional outlay that came out of that cohort
Yeah.
is they were going to take on something that had closed down in their country and been a positive game changing force in the nation.
Yeah. And I think what I hear there is that the church, our opportunity is to be adaptable and creative to solve the
Yeah.
problem. And so
Yep.
if one door gets closed, we just open the next one.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And so we're seeing that kind of stuff here and there. Most of the time, it's on the personal side. How do I
Yeah.
treat my wife or my kids, or other church leaders or business leaders? But periodically, we get to see nation changing, like in the case of that Constitution being rewritten, or in the case of the, a good work like Compassion getting shut down, and them able to revive an entire city of those kids, which was probably tens of thousands of kids.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So the other thing that I guess comes to mind is the Harley guy on Sunday versus the Harley guy with his Harley club as the Pastor Harley.
Yeah.
What do you think when I think about the future of the church, particularly in America or in the West, where
Mhm.
we're kind of moving into a post-Christian era?
Yeah.
Um, I feel like the church in 10 or 20 years is going to look dramatically different, and I kind of wonder if it's going to be the Harley pastor more than it is the Sunday pastor. What do you think?
Great question, Jason. And we actually did a deep dive on this a few years ago. We looked at the biblical word ecclesia,
Hmm.
which is the Greek word for church. And we did a deeper dive on what does that word mean for today.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting what you're seeing. And we saw all sorts of examples. In the Philippines, there was a pop-up business shop. They do coffee. They serve little special coffees, but they do it in a pop-up manner. And they got their little cart that they're pushing down various streets of Manila. And when they set up the shop, they're doing business, selling business, and they're meeting spiritual needs. And
Yeah.
out of this pop-up coffee shop, you're not going to believe what happened. It bursts little church communities. So they aren't churches like probably like you and I think. They're not like, the church I go to on a Sunday. It's not like that at all. It's a group of friends that hang out together that happen to like this coffee shop, and now they're meeting together in a real coffee shop, not the pop-up one, sharing life together and kind of digging in deeper on what does the Bible say, and leading people to Christ and growing them in Christ. And I'm seeing tons and tons of vehicles like that. They're house churches, they're coffee shop churches, they're McDonald's churches, but
Yeah.
they don't look anything like what you and I probably think of as church.
Yeah.
Certainly not what I grew up with. My mentality of church was, that place down the street I go to on Sunday. Now church is 24/7, operating on the byways and the highways of the world. And when you look at the New Testament, those are the models of churches, really. You didn't have these huge synagogues and structures. And I think we'll have both in the future. But I think you're going to have a lot more of the pop-up coffee shop kind of churches that are emerging, and it's really exciting. And so, for our case, we're having to equip people like that because in many cases, you have the church being pressured to close down.
Mm,
You have governments that are actually closing the buildings, and so everyone is having to pivot. And their pivot is the church can't you can't generate enough money to pay a pastor.
mhm.
So these people with a shepherding call, they actually start their own business, and they're doing church in the middle of their business community. And
Yeah.
so I think, Jason, you got your finger on something that's going to be wildly different. And, it's interesting. Stats for church in America have been on the decline for a long time. But guess what? The spiritual hunger of Gen Alpha and Gen Z is very high.
Yeah.
And so, the interest has more to do with community than it does
Mm,
with the institutional models of churches that we've had. And
yeah.
so, if you go ahead, yeah,
And I would say an authentic or a sincere type of community as well.
yeah. And so
You talked
these
about vulnerability earlier, right?
absolutely, yeah. So one of the game changers with our cohorts is every night we have someone share their full story.
Mm,
And when I say full story, I mean you're revealing everything. And we, as the initial faculty, kind of roll it out on the first night. And
yeah.
so when they hear Joe Handley is president of A3 with all the accolades you mentioned earlier, they're just blown away when I mention what sin I struggle with in life and how friends are helping me with it. There's people
Yeah.
in my life that say, I know you're junk,
Yeah.
So when they hear me share authentically the junk that's in my life, they can't believe that someone who's a known a fairly well known pastor or fairly well known mission leader is willing to reveal.
Yeah.
And that kind of authenticity and transparency is very attractive. And that's the setting that breaks down the walls, that
Yeah.
allowed these two guys that thought they were sheep stealing.
Hmm. Yeah.
They wouldn't have trusted each other if the authenticity weren't there. And when the
Yeah.
authenticity walls just, shoo, those walls just dropped, and they became real with one another. And I think this generation, even regardless of age, they're hungry for that kind of community. And that kind of community doesn't need a building on Sunday mornings to meet in. That kind of community can meet in your home. It can meet in the Harley Davidson Club. It can meet anywhere.
Yeah. So talk to us about that idea, because I think what you're also describing is this idea of, as a leader, knocking ourselves off the pedestal that people might try and put us on. So I think
Yeah.
that's an important thing, so that people don't see us as something different, but as just as the same and maybe even more broken than them. Like,
Yeah.
talk to
Yeah.
me more about that dynamic.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll give you an example. We've done most of our work in Asia. We're growing beyond that now into Africa and Europe and Latin America. But in Asia, every pastor is put on a pedestal. And
Hmm.
so one of the things we do in our process of 2-year journey is every week-long cohort, and for business leaders, it's weekends because they've not taken off a whole week. Um, we incorporate play into it. And for pastors in Asia, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to
Oh,
be
okay.
above the fray. You're not allowed to pray. You got to be serious. But when we get them playing their own sport, I'll never forget in Sri Lanka, their sport is cricket. And they
Okay.
had me out playing it. And have no idea, I play baseball, not cricket, right? So it's a whole different ball game. So I pulled my hamstring playing with because I didn't know what I was doing, right? And but they had so much fun, and it's in that atmosphere that they start to say, you know what, I'm just like everyone else in the congregation. I am a sinner saved by grace, and
Hmm.
nobody's going to get that unless I'm honest with that myself. And so taking yourself off the pedestal actually attracts people to you. Whether you're the CEO of a company or you're the senior pastor of a church, um, when you're open like that with people, and there's degrees of openness. It's one thing you say at your annual speech for the for the business, versus you're in a small group setting with your guy, the senior staff, ladies and men, right? Right.
Yeah.
Those are two different vehicles, right? You probably are not doing that to some degree on the stage, although some's okay there, right? But when you get deep in a closer setting, it really opens the doors for drastic change in your life, and frankly, it's quite healing,
Yeah.
because when you feel like you have to put on a mask all the time, then there's a part of you that is constantly worried about what are people thinking about me, and you're
Hmm.
putting on pretenses and you're walking with a mask and you don't feel safe.
Yeah.
And when you start to open up and you got people journeying with you that know your junk, um, it frees you from that bondage, and you
Yeah.
you are set free in a way that's remarkable. And so to get off those pedestals is huge. It
Yeah.
really does make a difference.
Yeah. Now, the other question I have is,
Mm,
so you talked about discipleship, and
yep.
we have the disciples, the 11, and then they replaced Judas. But then you have Paul, and Paul kind of makes those disciples seem like they're not doing a whole lot of anything. So talk to us about the difference between the first disciples
Yeah.
and the Paul model, and how they both play a part.
Okay, really, it's just about giftedness, right?
Yeah.
So I often say Joe Handley is a 5 talent guy. You know, there's other guys that are 10 talent guys, and there's other people that are 2 talent guys. God holds me responsible for my level of talent. So
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with the original disciples, right?
Yeah.
They're responsible for, they're not like Apostle Paul. He was a 10 talent guy.
Yeah.
Maybe there were 5 talent guys like me, right? Who knows? They're fishermen. They did a good job, right? So God doesn't need me or want me or call me to be something I'm not.
Hmm.
And so I'm no Tim Keller. I'm no Rick Warren. I'm no, those are 10 talent guys. They have phenomenal speaking gifts. They're in a different league than Joe Handley. And that's the Apostle Paul's, in different ways. God has singled them out and just said, I'm going to endow you with a unique set of gifts, Paul. But Timothy, your disciple, and Barnabas, your friend, they're not there to outshine you. Barnabas is only responsible for his 5 talents, and
Yeah.
Timothy for his five or two, perhaps. And so when we get into the comparison game, we screw things up.
Yeah.
Man, we all got to be like Apostle Paul. Well,
Hmm.
heck, not all of us are like Apostle Paul, right? Some of us are like Joe Handley, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Just be who God's called you to be,
Yeah.
and that's all right. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'd say that's a piece of the puzzle, is that we don't have to all be like Paul. We just have to be. You have to be Jason.
Yeah.
Jason's not called to be Joe or our friend Steve. We're different. And
Yeah.
you just need to be all that God's called you to be, and take your 5 talents and multiply them. Or if it's 2 talents, multiply them. Don't try to be Paul, because we can't be something we're not.
Yeah. Now, you wrote the book "Leading Well in Times of Disruption." The last decade, and I suspect the decade ahead, is going to be a lot of that for us. So, what
Yeah.
were some of the insights and wisdom that you have in that book that you could share with us?
Yeah, so that book was interesting. It actually was came out of the Lausanne movement, a
Okay.
set of listening calls on the biggest gaps in leadership development today, and what are the things we need to be focused on over the next decade. And it just happens to be a time of disruption. So the title is a bit of a misnomer, because it's more about gaps in leadership development than it
Oh,
is about disruption. That said, there are chapters in there about adaptive leadership that can help you with leading in times of disruption. But I'd say a lot of it goes back to these same set principles we've been talking about the whole hour almost, Jason. Is that a lot of it goes back to these core principles. With A3, we have 4 things in mind.
Okay.
And I think these four things in some ways cover some of the gamuts here. And we believe they build on each other. They're kind of building blocks. So we call them our four outcomes.
Mm,
And outcome number one is our walk with God. Is we call it living in a love relationship with God. That
mm,
has to be foundational, and there's a ripple effect that comes from that. Now, outcome number two is growing as a Christ-like leader. Some of that are tips on how to be a leader, but most of it is your character. But you can't have good character if you're not walking with God.
yeah.
So the foundational piece is first, right? You got to have a deep, abiding walk with Jesus. He changes your character. And as you grow in character and grow in leadership acumen, you know, then you get to the reproducibility side. The fourth or the third one is reproducing others,
Hmm.
reproducing leaders that have the same kind of abiding, characteristics in their life. They're
Yeah.
learn to follow Jesus and emulate him and spread that to others. And then finally, God's called us to mission. We need to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind and strength. But we also are called to go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them everything, to obey everything I've taught you, right? And thank God, lo, I'm with you always. God's always with us. That back to the beauty of that is I'm with you always means it's about abiding. And so the only way we can reproduce and keep things multiplying is by abiding. And so these
Mm,
things build on each other. And so that book, um, those four things are key principles you will see over and over and over again by the different authors. Every chapter is written by a different person
oh,
or
okay.
team, and they are addressing key gaps in the world today. So, one example would be discipleship gap, the
Mm,
number one gap recognized by two major Christian bodies today, the World Evangelical Alliance and the Lausanne Movement, is what is called the discipleship gap. And I'll give you an example of that. Rwanda, one of the most Christian countries in the world, had fighting between the two different tribal groups, both Christian, and yet they're fighting each other. Something's wrong with our Christianity
yeah.
if this is happening, right? And so that's a discipleship gap. It's back to what you and I talked out on the front of this call. It's not just about a decision to say I'm in and I've got kingdom salvation forever. It's about following Jesus and how do I treat my neighbor? If Jesus were to ask somebody in Rwanda, who's your neighbor? I think it would be the person on the other tribe.
Yeah.
And likewise, here in America, if God were to ask me who's my neighbor, I down the street from my house, right across the street from each other, this is amazing. One side of the street is a massive Donald Trump banner, with red and blue stars and stripes. I mean, just amazing, right? And then across the street from, I mean, directly across the street from them is a house that's filled with a rainbow flag and, peace, love, and harmony, and, and those guys are on opposite sides of the camp, right?
Yeah.
And who's my neighbor? My neighbor is both of them. God calls me to love my Trump friends, right? And God calls me to love my, friends that are maybe from LGBTQ community, right? And
Yeah.
and my job is to love on them, to treat them like Jesus, and hopefully walk a pathway so that when I have the opportunity to share the hope of Jesus, that becomes primary.
Yeah.
It's not about what side of the political spectrum you're on. God doesn't probably care if you're a Democrat or Republican. Now, there are behavioral things he cares about. Character
Yeah.
matters, right?
Yeah.
And both sides have character issues that need to grow. And so,
Yeah.
so as I am a neighbor, like God called me, I should be a good Samaritan, no matter if it's the Trump crowd or the Biden crowd or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that's a good example, but that's in essence the way I think. If Joe's living his best life now, um, that would be following Jesus and being a light to my neighbors and community.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Well, that's a great place to wrap it up.
Man, I had fun with you, Jason. Thanks for doing this. Just check us out. A3, we're a great community. We love investing in leaders. And if you're out there and you're at a place in life where you've got some gray hair or no hair like mine, and you want to invest in the next generation, millennials, Gen Z, maybe Alpha, and help them grow as Christ-like leaders, please call me. We need
Yeah.
people like you. Well, they're like I said, my friend said, Joe, please send us seasoned veteran leaders. We have no spiritual fathers. And likewise, we have women that say we have no spiritual mothers. And so I'd leave it with that, Jason. But what a delightful time with you. Thank you for giving me a little time today.
If people are interested, how do they contact you? What's your website? How do they reach out to
Yeah,
you?
a3leaders.org
Okay.
would be on the more ministry pastoral side, and a3.business. So
Okay.
a3leaders.org and a3.business. If you get on there, you'll either get in touch with me or one of our team, and we can plug and play.
Awesome. Well, I'll put a link in the show notes for anyone that's interested. Thank you so much, Joe, for teaching us about what it means to teach the few who teach the many.
Well, thanks. Great being with you, Jason.